Okay, so we're going to get started then on the presentation. Let me bring this up. So with Alan Hammer talking about uh, dahlias and he having to be out of the country, we wanted to expand some of the dahlia comments because he didn't think he had quite as much time or need as much time to cover that subject. So at NC State, we've done a number of nutrient disorders of running plants through the system, and one set that we've actually done is dahlias, but actually we haven't reported that information out there. So wanted to actually share that information, seeing how we're talking about dahlias anyway at this point. So the work that we're looking at was the results of Jared Barnes. He was a master's student here at NC State. He stayed for his PhD, which he just finished at Christmas. So he is looking for a job, by the way.
Brian, can I interrupt you for just a second? Have you had a chance to share your screen? We're not seeing your presentation.
Show my screen. Sorry, it got behind something else. Can you see it now?
Now we can see it.
Sorry about that. Any argument with technology, technology wins, unless you're told. So I appreciate that, Brian. So, okay. So back to dahlias. So we're looking at research that Jared Barnes did, part of his master's thesis. And so when we look at nutrient disorders, if you look at a system here and where the symptoms actually appear, either flowers, upper foliage, entire plant, or the lower foliage, it'll tell you a lot about what type of nutrient disorder that you're looking at. And that's in fact how we're going to handle things today in this presentation. So we'll start with the lower foliage. The most common disorders that we see on the lower foliage are nitrogen deficiency, magnesium deficiency, potassium deficiency, phosphorus, and boron. So we're going to go through each one of those. So when you look at typical symptomology, now nitrogen deficiency in the case here, you can see in the lower right-hand side, the -N means a deficiency of nitrogen. You can see overall yellowing of the plant. It's a complete yellowing. And notice where those symptoms are. Are they at the upper foliage? No, they're at the lower foliage. And this is a little more advanced. You're starting to see the necrosis coming along some of those margins. But stunted growth, yellow lower leaves. That's very typical symptoms that we'll see with a deficiency of nitrogen. As things advance, you can see here that the necrosis has expanded on those leaves that were initially yellow. This is about 2 weeks later on some of the similar plants. And those symptoms also then start working their way up the plant. That's because what? Nitrogen is a mobile element. So it will mine the nitrogen out of the lower leaves and move it up to the growing tip. That's why we see it at the lower foliage. And then finally, under very severe conditions, you see here is total necrosis. So this will happen if you're really growing them lean and mean. Now, we're trying to kill these plants, and you can see we really do a good job at it. But we're growing them without any nitrogen in the silica sand. So we have this defoliation occurring with the plant. The shift gears then, another common situation, especially in the southeast, where we don't have limestone bedrock. We don't have alkalinity in a lot of the southeastern part of the U.S. Without being over limestone, we don't get calcium in the water, but we also don't naturally get magnesium. So we run into this situation quite a bit down here, whereas when I used to be in the Midwest, we didn't see magnesium deficiencies so often. So what are we looking at? We're looking here at a classical case, and you look at that leaf, interveinal chlorosis. So the veins are green, and the space between those veins are yellow, and it's very clearly, you can see that in this up close shot. As things progress, under more severe conditions, you'll get an overall yellowing, and it will also then start moving its way up the plant. And so this is also a severe case in the southeast, and again, you really don't see it in the Midwest or the prairie provinces that often. Switching gears slightly is potassium deficiency. Now, are you going to see it? No, probably not very often. And the reason is, you're supplying nitrogen at a pretty well a 1-to-1 ratio with potassium, or at least K2O. And so usually in most conditions, you are supplying ample amounts of potassium. But and I might add that on a lot of plants, potassium and magnesium deficiencies can mimic each other, but by the most part, we're going to see magnesium problems 99 times, and the last time it's going to be a potassium problem. So it's not really that common of a situation. So you see that there's some necrosis in the intervenal areas starting out here, and then here you can see that those necrotic areas start resulting in lower leaf death, and that is very common to see that occurring. And also look at that plant. How big is it? It's very small. And so the situation that's going on here is that you'll see stunning of that growth going on with that plant. And so that is a very common situation of a very small plant material that's there. And under very severe conditions, you can see in this case here that you're looking at intervenal necrosis occurring on that plant. So going on then to phosphorus deficiency, that's the plant that is on the right. You can see in this case, number one, very much a smaller stunted plant. We didn't have the shots that really showed it, but you'll see a more dull green coloration, a smaller plant. Then those dull green areas will then go necrotic, the leaf drop will happen, and it will be stunted. It's not as yellow as what you would see then with a nitrogen deficiency, and so that might help you differentiate between the two for what's going on. But you also know if you're doing like a 15015 where you're not applying any phosphorus, that's going to lead you to the conclusion that you're looking more at a phosphorus problem than a nitrogen problem. And then here's a case of toxicity. This is excess boron. That's denoted by the +B at the bottom. Now look at that leaf. Look at it's a lower leaf, and look of where those necrotic spots are. Those necrotic spots are at the end of the veins, and that's because as the boron's taken up, it gets deposited at those margins, and you can see a classic burn. So this will happen on a lot of different plants. If you overdose with one application of excess boron, this is what will end up happening to that plant. Now, we don't stop. We keep on giving it boron, and so you can see in this next slide that then those necrotic areas will expand along the entire outer leaf margin. And then over time, you will see that total death will happen for those lower leaves, and you can see that the symptomology is starting to work its way up, and you also end up getting more of a yellow band under severe cases on those leaves. So this is a chronic supply of excess boron. That first one would be more typical if you just gave an overdose. And the same thing would show up with the same symptomology with almost any other micronutrient that you would add at excessive levels will cause that type of symptomology. So you'd have to clue into what you've done culturally for that to cause that sudden necrosis. It will happen in the matter of 5 days after an application. We've seen that very commonly occurring with pansies in particular in the fall to try to avoid boron deficiency, because that margin between deficient to adequate to excess is very, very narrow on that plant. So now we want to shift to a different zone of the plant. We're going to look at the entire plant, the middle region for the most part. And you know, if we were talking poinsettias, we would be looking at molybdenum coming in there as a possibility, but molybdenum's not really a problem with dahlias. But so the only element we're really of concern with here is sulfur deficiency. Typically, when it first develops, you'll see it come in at the middle part of the plant, then it will work its way up, and given enough time, it will work its way down. Now keep in mind, yellowing also occurs with nitrogen, but what's the difference? The difference is nitrogen deficiency will begin at the bottom of the plant and then work its way up. And so if you see this initially, you will very clearly see when sulfur deficiency, it being in the middle to upper zone, and the bottom foliage will be green. You can see that on a lot of plants. Now, when do we see sulfur deficiency? Not very often. Usually sulfur is a byproduct. It's not on the label of your fertilizers other than saying it's an ingredient. It's not listed as a percent. The only real place you get into trouble is if you're using a CalMag formula. In order to keep the calcium in solution, they have to use magnesium nitrate, not magnesium sulfate. And so you typically are not getting any sulfur with this type of a treatment. And we have seen poinsettia crops run out of sulfur and have a pale yellow coloration. So it's not common, but it does happen under greenhouse conditions. So here's just a close-up, overall yellowing going on, and then finally, very intensive yellow coloration. You will then get to some necrosis occurring on those leaves over time, like the leaf that's shown there on the right. So that's sulfur deficiency. And again, upper foliage working at our middle, working its way up, whereas nitrogen is at the bottom foliage initially when you see that with a plant. So finally, let's look at, as far as foliage is concerned, problems that occur with the upper foliage. And so we're looking at iron deficiency, calcium deficiency, and boron deficiency. So here's a very typical symptomology. Again, it's interveinal chlorosis. We've seen that before with magnesium deficiency, but what's the key here? Iron problems occur with the upper foliage. That's where it starts. Magnesium deficiency in most cases occurs on the lower foliage first and works its way up. So that location is your key to finding out, or at least deciding between the two. Now, if it's upper foliage, you can do a pH test. Typically, you're looking at probably a pH above 6.5 with dahlias to start seeing problems. Now, if it's a lot of plants, you're probably looking at a pH problem of it being too high. Maybe you have a lot of alkalinity. If it's scattered plants, look at the root system. Is it root rot? Is it overwatering occurring with that plant? So there might be a compromised root system that inhibit the uptake of iron. And so even though you might have adequate iron being supplied to the plant. Also here with this plant, it's more advanced. You see necrotic spots. That's basically sunburning going on with that plant. And you can see here more of an overview. And so, so again, how do you differentiate? Upper foliage, iron, lower foliage, a magnesium deficiency is what we're looking at with these plants. So the pH range, there is a wide variation that's out there published. You know, 5.5 to 6.5 is a recommended pH range, but you probably ought to target a little narrower to avoid low pH problems, and at the upper end of the range to avoid iron deficiency problems. So a 5.7 to 6.3 would probably be a better target range where you're trying to target that pH, that green zone on that graph. And if it starts nudging in the yellow zone, so between 5.5 and 5.7 at the bottom and 6.3 and 6.5 at the top, you start making some management changes to bring that pH back down to where it needs to be. So let's then shift gears to another problem, and this is calcium deficiency. So this is the foliar disorders that you would see. Is it very common? Really, no, it's not that common, but we're able to induce it with our system. And what we've seen initially as the symptoms is on the upper foliage. And the key here is that many times with foliar disorders on a wide assortment of plants, we will see those symptoms initially appear on a leaf that's completing the last 50% of its expansion. So it's already half size and it's finishing the other half. And the reason is that is a huge sink for calcium, because calcium is the building block of those plant cells, and that's what runs out of gas. You don't have those building blocks, and so if you don't build those cells with the calcium in the structure, the cell dies. So you see the necrosis that's there, and that in fact is what's happening with this leaf that you see pictured here. So the interveinal zone, this is occurring as far as the leaf is concerned. You can see then over time, those necrotic lesions will expand, and you can get some overall yellowing also occurring on some margins around those necrotic spots. And then ultimately, you'll have plant death. Now, many times you need to keep in mind that what's going on above the plant in the shoot area is also occurring on the lower foliage, or in the roots, I should say. And so what we're seeing here many times is that the top growth of the plant collapses, and that's because the root system has died, because calcium is taken up right behind the root cap, and if you have death of that root, you have no calcium uptake, and also then you don't have any water uptake. And so this is a very severe case that we can induce because we are growing them in silica sand that you can see there with the pot. So will you get this to this condition very often? Not really when you look at dahlias. So the other upper leaf disorder that's there is boron deficiency. Now, calcium, we very quickly went to necrosis. Brian Krug, when he did his PhD, he found that out with pansies. So, you know, if at first you got top growth going to necrosis, you think calcium first. If you go to distorted growth, thickening growth, you're going to start thinking boron first. Now of course, broad mites, herbicide drift like a 2,4-D type will also cause some of this type of a disorder, so you have to make sure you check out those other conditions. But you can clearly see here in the area around the circle that those leaves are thick, they're distorted, they're curled, and that's all typical symptomology that goes on with a deficiency of boron. And then over time, you also then will get some necrosis, but again, it's distortion, then necrosis, whereas necrosis comes first with calcium. And so that helps you differentiate between those two disorders. And then finally, under very severe cases, you'll have death of the growing tip. Then you'll have axillary shoots start forming, and if boron's still limited, those can end up dying. But you can clearly see here that there is death of the growing tip. This plant, if you feel it, if you put your hand on there, it'll be hard. And if you push down on some of those leaves, they'll actually crack off, and you can see the leaf that's basically at the 5 o'clock time frame. You can see that the leaf has cracked. That's a very typical type of symptom that you see with boron deficiency. So that will help you differentiate what's going on. And then finally, looking at some of the flower disorders, and we're looking at really only calcium and boron here. And so in this case, you see that you have death of the flower, you have withering of the stems, and you can also clearly see on the leaves the necrosis is there. So that leads you more into a calcium problem that you need to start looking at, focusing if there's a calcium issue that's going on. And then you have total peduncle collapse on that plant. Same thing occurs like on stem topple of tulips. So commonly that occurs with a calcium deficiency. And when you go to boron, again, there's distorted growth and you have death of that flower, not quite as severe or as quick as calcium initially, and then you can see here in this case that you get the death right behind that petal or the flower bud that's there. So it's very similar. At this point, it might be a little tougher to tell the difference between calcium problems and boron, but fill that plant, look for that distorted growth. That's going to point you more into a boron problem than a calcium problem. So in summary, when you look at things, what's most common? What are you going to see? You know, because some of these things, we work pretty hard to kill these plants, so we're able to get these symptomology, but are you going to see that? Probably not. But nitrogen deficiency or low EC is probably the most common situation. In areas without magnesium in the water supply, like the Southeast, North Carolina, Georgia, we don't have that magnesium, so we see that lower leaf intervenal chlorosis, quite common. In areas of the Great Plains, the prairie provinces, when you have a high level of alkalinity, that substrate pH is going to go up over time, and what do you get? You get iron deficiency coming in, and so you see that more common in those areas of the country. So some of the target numbers to look at, we talked earlier about substrate pH. You know, the wide range, 5.5 to 6.5, but probably you ought to target between 5.7 and 6.3. That would be a better range just to make sure things are in the middle. But I can tell you the literature was pretty darn wide as far as recommendations that were there. Fertilization notes, this is probably, I would say this is more for the vegetative cutting types. You're looking at probably about 150 part per million. There's some flexibility there on recommendations. Some are lower. Some of the Danish recommendations are quite a bit higher. My guessing with the Danish recommendations, they're not irrigating as often because of cloudy conditions in the spring, so they have to load that substrate up when they only get to irrigate once a week, whereas in areas with more sunlight, you can lower that fertility levels. And so target EC values are there for both SME and pour through, and those values for the nitrogen rate and the EC values are assuming you're top irrigating. So if you're sub-irrigating, what do? The standard rule is 25% lower that you would be targeting on those values. And so other ideas to keep in mind is that a lot of ammoniacal nitrogen will cause soft growth, big leaves, so limit that to probably 10–20% of your total nitrogen being supplied. And of course, what's phosphorus do? That gives you the plant stretch. So a fertilizer such as the 13–213 or the 17–417 would help you limit the amount of phosphorus. I mean, 20–10–20 is going to give you a lot more stretch because at 200 part per million N, you're giving 44 part per million phosphorus, and that's more than what you need because your target level is somewhere in the 5 to 10 part per million range that you ought to be looking at. And then finally, especially for us in the Southeast or other areas without magnesium in the water supply, it's always useful to add some Epsom salts monthly at 1 pound per 100 gallons of water. Works very well at keeping things green and avoiding lower leaf intervenal chlorosis. So we went over things, we went over the key to signs and where things are located. So hopefully that will help you improve your diagnostic ability when you do run into nutritional disorders. A lot of these symptoms are very similar to other plants and can be applied to them and just not dahlias. And then especially when you're getting started at trying to decipher what's going on, it's always a good idea to submit a tissue sample and a soil sample to a commercial lab so that you can then see what's going on to help confirm your diagnosis, because until you're comfortable with that, it's probably not a great idea to be shooting from the hip. You need to have some data to back you up for what's going on. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.